Today we're going to take a quick look at the habitual tense in Hindi. The habitual tense is used to make everyday statements, and through examining the habitual tense, we'll learn some new Hindi verbs. So let's get started. In Hindi, the habitual tense is used to express ongoing actions or habitual actions. So let's take a look at the examples. गुरुवार को मैं पढ़ता हूँ. This translates to I study on Thursdays. Clearly, an ongoing habitual action is being shown in this sentence. Let's take a look at the next example. मैं अमेरिका में रहता हूँ, which translates to I live in America. Once again, this sentence is expressing an ongoing habitual action, so it too is in the habitual tense. The habitual tense form of a Hindi verb is created from the verb's infinitive, which is the form of the verb that isn't altered to agree with a specific subject or tense. For example, in English, infinitives often start with to followed by the action. For example, to run, to cry, or to live are all infinitives. As you can see, these verbs are not in a specific tense, nor do they agree with a specific subject. Hence why they're infinitives. Before we dive right into making the habitual tense forms of Hindi verbs, we gotta know some more Hindi verbs. Until now, we primarily created sentences in Hindi using the conjugations hai, which generally means is, hai, which generally means are, hu, which means am, or ho, which means are. So our sentences so far have expressed states of being rather than concrete actions. Because all four of these verbs that we've used in our sentences are some form of to be. So they express states of being rather than concrete actions. So let's look at some Hindi verb infinitives that express concrete actions. Likhna, which means to write. Notice the aspirated k here. So it's not likhna, it's likhna. Padhna, which means to read or study. Dena, which means to give. Lena, which means to take. Bolna, which means to speak. Karna, which means to do. Khana, which means to eat. Pina, which means to drink. Rehna, which means to live. So even though it's spelled rahana, it's pronounced rehna. Dekhna, which means to see or watch. Jana, which means to go. And ana, which means to come. Notice how all of these infinitives ended with the suffix na. This is similar to how English infinitives start with to, followed by the action. The habitual form of a Hindi verb consists of two components: a modified version of the verb's infinitive, followed by one of the conjugations of hona, like hai, hu, hai, or ho. Together, these components form the habitual form. So we start by modifying the verb's infinitive. The first step of this modification is to remove the na suffix from the infinitive to form what's called a verb stem. So let's look at the infinitive pina. Recall that pina means to drink. If we remove na, we get the verb stem pi. The next step is to add a new suffix to the verb stem. We insert one of three suffixes depending on the number and gender of the sentence's subject. So if the subject of the sentence is masculine singular, we add the suffix ta to the verb stem. So if we had the verb stem pi, adding ta would make it pita. If the subject is masculine plural, we add the suffix te to the verb stem. So if we have the verb stem pi, adding te would make pite. And if the subject is feminine, regardless of whether it's singular or plural, we add the suffix ti. So that would make biti in the case of the verb stem be. Now, recall in Hindi, we often treat otherwise singular individuals as plural nouns in order to show respect. Such individuals include an older family member, like a parent or sibling, a teacher, or someone who you would address using the formal आप. So for example, if you're talking about a respected individual who is a male, you would actually use the masculine plural suffix. Recall how I said earlier that the habitual form of a verb consists of two parts. So far, we've only done one of those parts, which is modifying the verb's infinitive. Now we have to add the second part, which is a conjugation of hona that agrees with the subject of the sentence. If the subject of the sentence is singular, we add hai. Following the modified infinitive. However, if the subject of the sentence is specifically main, we add hon instead, just as we've done so many times before. So if our sentence has a subject that's singular and we have pita or piti, we would add hai, assuming the subject is not main, to make it pita hai or piti hai. Now, if the subject is plural, we add hai, following the modified infinitive. However, recall that if the subject is tum, we use the conjugation ho. This applies when making the habitual form as well. So, if the subject of a sentence was plural, and we had either pite or piti, assuming the subject is not tum, we would add hai to make it pite hai or piti hai. Now recall that the ti suffix is used if the subject is feminine, whether the subject be feminine singular or feminine plural. If the subject is feminine singular, but not main, we use the conjugation hai. If the subject is feminine plural, but not tum, we use the conjugation hai. When we add the conjugations hai, hon, ha, or ho, we may be tempted to translate them to mean am, or are, or is, just as we've always done in the past. However, when these conjugations are part of the habitual form of a verb, they do not translate to mean am, or are, or is. This is because together the modified infinitive plus the conjugation of hona equate to the meaning of the habitual form of a verb. So pita hai and piti hai mean drinks, like he drinks or she drinks. And then pite hai or piti hai equates to drink, like they drink. It can also be drinks if you're using plurality to refer to a single individual in a formal manner, like my father drinks. Let's look at some examples of sentences utilizing the habitual tense. Let's start by revisiting a previous example. मैं अमेरिका में रहता हूँ, which translates to I live in America. Now, we know that the subject, मैं, is masculine, and it's because the modified infinitive is using the ta suffix. Recall that ta is used if the subject of the sentence is masculine singular. We use हूँ to agree with the subject मैं. वो समोसे खाती है. She eats samosas. So samose is just the plural form of samosa. Now, how do you know that वो means she in this sentence? Well, the modified infinitive uses the suffix the. And remember, we use the for a feminine subject. Since vo is the subject of the sentence, that means vo must mean she in the sentence. मेरी नानी जी किताबें लिखती हैं. My maternal grandmother writes books. So nani ji refers to maternal grandmother. And in this case, since we're being respectful, we use हैं because we're considering nani ji to be plural. However, nani ji is still feminine, which is why the modified infinitive would have the suffix the. Now, to form the negative sentence in the habitual tense, we add nahi before the modified verb. And we can also drop the conjugation of hona if we want. Tum nahi padte or tum nahi padte ho, which means you don't read, study. So nahi goes right before the modified infinitive, which is padte. आप हर दिन पानी नहीं पीते हैं और आप हर दिन पानी नहीं पीते. You don't drink water every day. So once again, nahi appears right before the modified infinitive pite. In negative sentences in the habitual tense, the conjugation of hona may be expressed for emphasis if so desired. So there you have it. Remember to keep practicing to get a hang of that two-component procedure in order to form the habitual form of a verb. And I hope to see you next time.